Hey, congratulations on a new season of Betrayal, season number 2, which is now available on iHeartRadio. You know what's really interesting about this? It's a conversation starter. And I know that guys are going to feel guilty because guys tend to keep a lot of secrets. But the thing is, though, is that maybe, and I'm hoping and praying, that it clears hearts, that it clears the way for there to be conversations.
Yeah, I agree. And thanks for having us. That's kind of when we first started this project. And I wrote into the Betrayal podcast after listening to season 1, Jen's story. That's what I found was kind of lacking is, everybody wants to read about it and, do their investigating on the internet on who it was and why they did it, but nobody really wants to talk about it. And I felt really isolated. So I was really grateful for Andrea and her team, telling my story and, doing it in such a patient and appropriate way.
Yeah, I guess, I'm sorry, Era. I remember last season we talked about Jen's story with you. Yeah. And after that aired, we had gotten so many emails from listeners of Jen's story that wrote in with similar stories to Ashley. Women who had found things on their husband's computer and were concerned and confronted with this idea of turning their husband in. And we noticed that there was this increase, this dark side of society where husbands were doing this, women didn't know what to do. And we felt like we had to tell this story and explore this type of crime, husbands in possession of child sexual assault material. Mm-hmm. And Ashley's story was compelling and dramatic and heartbreaking. And I felt like was a really interesting entry into that conversation that you spoke to earlier. It's like, how do we actually talk about this issue, which is really a public health crisis, in a way that makes you care about the individuals that are going through it?
Yeah. Andrea, you dive into this in the way of bringing the entire story forward. This isn't just sitting down with a writing instrument and basically writing out your thoughts. You bring people to the studio, or you go to them with the equipment to get that story to grow forward.
Right. Yeah, we went out to Salt Lake in December and met with Ashley and a few other women who have similar stories, and met Ashley's family and her community, and met with a ton of law enforcement from the state level to the federal level, and just really wanted to uncover everything from how the state's handling this, how the federal level is handling these types of crimes. And we really just we were there for almost 2 weeks, Ashley, right? Yes. And it was really intense and heavy, but it's important.
Ashley, you put your children first. There are many marriages that don't do that, where the wife will go, this is my husband first, then you guys come along. So it's very interesting to see where you were standing on that.
Yeah. And it is interesting to think about because even, I received and I'm still receiving a little bit of backlash from my husband's family because, I am a wife first and my kids are going to leave someday. And, and we talked to a gentleman from the UK that runs a foundation called Lucy Faithful. And he was giving us some statistics, and he said that about 50% of people that go through this in the UK actually go back to their partner, which I thought was crazy because for me, it was a no-brainer. I mean, there wasn't a choice. That this is just this is what had to be done.
How do you discover all of these stories, Andrea, in the way that it's like there's so much that needs to be shared, but at the same time, you've also got to protect someone's heart, just like Ashley?
Yeah, like I said, we had gotten so many emails with women that had similar stories to Ashley. And then when we started talking to her, what Ashley had to go through from the moment that she discovered what was on her husband's computer to actually hours later having him apprehended was an extraordinary 24 hours for a woman to go through. Ashley was sitting there trying to process the ending of her marriage, how she was going to take care of 3 kids, feeling like, what I find so interesting is you have these women, these partners that feel like they are betraying their partner by turning them in. It's a really interesting dynamic when the partner is the one that's breaking the law, violating the safety of their home. But these women who are doing the right thing are made to feel like they're the ones doing something wrong. So it's really interesting dynamics at play. And I just thought Ashley was such a open and receptive person to have tough conversations and just share her life. I mean, it's really brave of her to do this. So, just reading the emails and having the initial conversations with Ashley, that's why we started off with her story.
So Ashley, when she's talking about, when you have to, decide what is happening in that moment, it is your husband, it is your family. The police have their story. Where do you find truth and trust in your own heart when there's so many different things coming at you at one time? What do you believe?
Right. So there's an interesting dynamic to my story. And we cover it in episode 2, Blood Ties, because when I first found out, I went to a trusted family member of his that was a police officer.
Yeah.
And his initial response was, you don't know for sure that's what you saw. Don't go jump off the deep end and tell everybody. And so there's that dynamic too, where maybe there's others in, your, and especially mine in my familiar circle that they couldn't even comprehend it. There's no way he could have done this. And so to kind of reconcile that in my own heart and in my own head, it wasn't until, I think the grieving process is so interesting for each, and it's really an individual experience. But for me, it wasn't until about 2 months after. So he had served 30 days in and then was out on pretrial, and we were going for one of our dumb court dates to schedule another court date. And I found the discovery papers of the case, and that basically outlines everything that law enforcement found in a detailed manner. And it wasn't until then that when I read the depth of what he had done, not just to capture these photos of these young children, but also that he had recorded my daughter. And that's when I knew the truth right then. And that's when it kind of really set off for me that, our marriage and our life, there was no way of going back. There was no way of, the only thing I could do from this point forward was fight for those girls, fight for my daughter, fight for my other kids. So, yeah. So
many people, though, what they do, they become cold-hearted. It's almost like they want to shame themselves and put themselves in a position of disbelief and denying the situation from happening. But you kept digging. You kept going into an area where you needed answers right now.
Yeah, I'd like to maybe give a little credit to, I studied criminal justice and have always been super intrigued by, the criminal mind in general. And so, which was really confusing for me that this had been going on, in my own home, and I had no idea. So probably a good thing I didn't go into criminal justice. But yeah, I did. I had to know the answers. There was really uncomfortable questions that I felt like if I knew the answer to, that it would give me more of a foundation to just, be cold and be awful. But the truth of it is, when somebody passes away, you kind of have to deal with that finality of maybe never getting answers for anything. But it's even worse when somebody doesn't pass away and you will never get a true answer.
What about the siblings in the way of, because I don't know why my mother and father divorced. She never would ever tell me. It's like he had to have done something wrong. Somewhere along the line, do you tell your children what went wrong here and what was taking place? Or are you going to be like my mother and just try to keep it away from me for the rest of my life?
I think initially for a lot of women in my situation, we want to, in any area of our lives, protect our children from hurting, right? And I've always had pretty open conversations, age appropriate with the kids. And my initial thought for the first 48 hours was, I'm not going to tell them a thing. They can never know about this.
Yeah.
They can just think that he had a mental breakdown and that was it. But we're in a different era of cell phones and social media, and everything's at their fingertips. And once our story hit the local news, I knew there was no hiding. I knew I had to tell them. I mean, even my youngest child, I don't think she quite understands what it means to have, explicit images of children. I don't really think she gets what that means, but she will one day. And so we've had really, really hard conversations with the children, because they deserve to know. And if we don't have those conversations, then, the chances of history repeating itself, I'm not saying with my children, but just in general, is far greater. So those conversations, I'm so grateful that I had them early on, because I don't know if I would have had the courage to do it.
Mm-hmm. Andrea, one of the things that we need to talk about is the SASS. How important is this, and how, is it something that everybody can get a hold of?
Do you mind rephrasing the question, Arrow? I'm not sure I know what you mean.
Basically, you cover the SASS inside your podcast, and it's one of those, because you're creating a community with Betrayal season 1 and season 2, and the thing is that you're going to have your followers, you're going to have those that want to share their story, and so I want, when listeners see and hear about the SASS, they need to know what it is.
I think that the number one thing about this community is just, and last season was, a whole different story, right. But there are women like Ashley and what they're going through that related to, I'm living with someone, something happens and I realize that they're essentially a stranger, and there's a ton of betrayal trauma that's involved. There's a ton of identity things that they have to work through. In this particular instance, I think in terms of the community and just education, Ashley mentioned it earlier where, she's trying to have conversations with her kids. But the reality is, I'm 36. I'm just learning about a whole new issue, which is child sexual assault material, which no one wants to talk about. And the reality is that there were 29 million tips just last year alone. And it's a public health crisis.
Yes.
And so when I was going through material, and I was sitting at the former U.S. Attorney's Office, John Huber, talking about this issue and what he had to deal with as U.S. Attorney of Utah, and I was reading what actually this material is, I realized I don't actually understand it. These are crimes that have been committed. These are pictures of crimes that have been committed. And so our fundamental understanding of what these things are, and really what we need to do and be aware of what this is really entering this issue into a larger conversation that no one is having. So I think that, number one, this podcast is trying to explain that having healthy conversations with your partner about their interests, what they're consuming, and exploring those conversations first and foremost is a really good step. I think some people don't even want to touch, like, hey, what are you looking at online? What are those interests of you? It's a world where people don't really understand, and it's not super well studied because it's just the way it is. But just to start having initial conversations with your partner can be helpful.
But you're absolutely right. I mean, here in North Carolina, you're constantly reading about these predators, and they're being arrested. They're school teachers, they're preachers, and you go, what happened here? Because I'll tell you what happens on the other side. When I want to go and do something, they put such an investigation on me because they want to make sure that I am not. And so I'm feeling both sides of it here. Those that are busted and those that are going, I didn't do anything. I just want to volunteer my time.
Right. And one of the biggest things that I learned through doing this season was I always thought that the book was being thrown at these offenders.
Yeah.
Right. So like you see these headlines of, principal or vice principal being arrested for quote unquote child pornography. just the words child pornography is a problem because you're kind of putting it in the category of adult material, which it is not. These are pictures, these are videos of crimes being committed against non-consenting children. That's the issue number one. And then number two, you see these headlines and you're like, oh my God, they're going to be going away for years. And then working with Ashley, I realized that these individuals, the offenders, are only going away for maybe a year. There's just not enough prison cells in the country to really hold all these people that are consuming this material. And so, within a year, Ashley's ex-husband will be out. And what does that mean for the community? And it's just kind of this area of the judicial system that people aren't really focusing on. And the problem is like, I know this is a tough conversation, Arrow. I know that it's hard, and I know that people are just like, oh no, I don't want to talk about this. But when I realized that these offenders are only going away for like a year, maybe 6 months, I mean, Ashley was afraid her husband wasn't going to do any time.
Oh boy.
That's just the reality. That's the reality.
Wow. Ashley, May has always been known as Mental Health Month. I believe that Mental Health Month is every month. There's going to be listeners that are tuning in right now to hear your story, especially with the podcast season number 2, and they're going to want to know where to go to get mental health. Mental health has gone to the computer. Some of these people you can't even get in to see. What do you suggest for these women that need help? And because who wants to talk on a computer?
Right. Yeah, it is interesting. My therapist is Jessica Baum, and she's a part of the podcast as well. She wrote a really, really great book. I think it's called Anxiously
Attached.
Yeah, Anxiously Attached. And it is such a great book because it helps you understand the reasons behind some of maybe the reasons why you've made the decisions that you've made, and the different adaptive strategies that you came up with as a child that have, made their way into adulthood. So I guess like my answer is because mental health help is expensive. I mean, it's so expensive. And I firsthand, having all 3 children, going to therapy, and plus myself, it's time consuming, it's expensive. So I say for those women or those people in general who can't get in or can't afford it, start investigating yourself, start reading. My biggest thing was, although I know some of these, social media communities or even local, self-help communities like AA or Celebrate Recovery, although they're not specific to what I have dealt with, they have been super, super helpful, and they are free, and I found community there. But that's really what I think it comes down to, is really finding somebody that can listen to your story without judgment, and really sometimes without questions, just letting you talk as you process whatever it is that, whatever trauma you've gone through.
Andrea, what is your secret sauce in the way of how do you take something so tragic and make it a story and put it into a podcast with several episodes? Because, so many people would say, oh, it's a Debbie Downer. No, this is not a Debbie Downer. This is a real story. And you have this way of keeping us connected.
I think that you said it just now. We lead from a place of connection. What Ashley went through and the hours and the days that she kind of lived and existed while she was trying to keep her family together, people can gravitate towards that and access that emotionally. And from there, we can tackle a larger conversation. So we always try to explore these stories from the human and victim perspective. And we start there. And that's kind of the entry point to discuss something larger. And maybe the audience would be receptive to learning something a little bit more that they would usually say, I don't know about that. But that's usually how we approach it.
Wow. You've got to come back to this show anytime in the future. The door is always going to be open for you.
Aw. Thanks, Arrow.
Thank you, Arrow.
You be brilliant today, okay?
I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks to you, too.